To page 21, House Bill 2269. It is a measure to amend the Code of Virginia relating to a prohibition on participation by the Commonwealth in any regional transportation sector emissions program. The bill is reported for Committee on Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources.
Delegate from Franklin, Delegate Poindexter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the body, House Bill 2269 provides that the state or any agency of the state, local jurisdiction may not establish a reasonable transportation sector emissions program or may not participate in TCI or any similar compacts on a regional basis. However, if the state may do that so long as you and I, their representatives, get a vote on whether or not the regulations are okay or not. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, transportation is essential to everything we do. We have an entire legal framework, laws, regulations, funding, secretariat. The governor signs all our laws dealing with transportation. So TCI and those type of organizations are outside the entire framework of what we do in transportation in Virginia. For that reason, I believe that the people's representative, you and I, deserve a vote on any such proposal. Mr. Speaker, I move the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading.
Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? All those in favor say aye. All those opposed, no. The bill is engrossed and passed to its third reading.
House Bill 2611 is a bill to amend the Code of Virginia relating to regional greenhouse gas initiative, prohibition on participation by the Commonwealth. Bill is reported for Committee on Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources.
Delegate from Franklin, Delegate Poindexter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, members of the body, House Bill 2611 deals with electricity generation instead of the transportation sector of a similar bill. House Bill 2611 provides that the Commonwealth, nor its agencies, nor any jurisdiction in the Commonwealth may establish a cap-and-trade CO2 program, or they may not participate in a regional group that does such a scheme. However, and if again, the state may participate in RGGI or any similar programs around the country, provided that the Virginia General Assembly votes on the actual regulations coming from those efforts. Mr. Speaker, this bill is not about RGGI, and it's not about deniers and climate change and anthropogenic global warming arguments. It's whether the people get a vote on such a scheme. I would move that the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading.
Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to its third reading? All those in favor say aye.
Speaker.
I'm sorry. I apologize. Delegate from Arlington, Delegate Lopez.
Thank you, Speaker. Would the gentleman rise for a question?
Delegate yield for a question.
I yield for a question.
Delegate yield.
Thank you, Speaker. Would the delegate agree with the National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Academy of Sciences, the IPCC, and NASA that climate change is real and needs to be addressed?
Mr. Speaker, I would say to the gentleman, throughout history, we've had deniers, we've had those that advocate for certain different things. I'd say to the gentleman he might go back and look at Copernicus, where the earth was the center of the universe, or look at Galileo, where the Catholic Church decried scripture and science settled, or to Einstein, where time and space were settled, but he said, no, it's relative. They were all deniers, and many of them were ruined in their lives and put off of it. But it turns out they were right.
Mr. Speaker, follow-up question.
Delegate yield for another question.
Or Demosthenes.
I yield, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate yields to slow down a little bit. Delegate yields.
Would the gentleman agree with the recent report that stated coastal communities and ecosystems that support them are increasingly threatened by the impacts of climate change without significant reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions and regional adaptation measures? Many coastal regions will be transformed by the latter part of this century, and that climate change creates new risks and exacerbates existing vulnerabilities in communities across the U.S., presenting growing challenges to human health and safety, quality of life, and the rate of economic growth?
I would say, Mr. Speaker, I would say to the gentleman that the recent report from the federal government was was presented and prepared and actually released through the regular process, and there were a lot of deep state operatives and people from the previous administration that pushed those policies, and that there's a lot of, again, there's a difference of opinions on that. We might want to look at some land sinking instead of the water rising as well.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for one final question?
Will the delegate yield for another question?
I yield, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would it matter to the delegate that this report, the National Climate Assessment, was released by the Trump administration?
Quite aware that, Mr. Speaker, I'm quite aware that it was released by the Trump administration. But the problem is not whether or not the land's going down or the water's coming up or whatever. The purpose of the bill is so the gentleman now can get to vote on the policy, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the bill.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the body, Virginia is ground zero for sea level rise. This is a climate crisis with consistent floods in every corner of the state, especially on the coast. Coastal Virginia is second only to New Orleans as the largest U.S. population center at greatest risk of flooding due to sea level rise. Norfolk's water levels have increased by 1.5 feet since the 1920s. Coastal communities like Norfolk are being forced to learn to live with severe flooding and impassable roads. Joining or otherwise participating in RGGI would benefit Virginia consumers, especially low-income residents, by lowering utility bills. RGGI has shown that states can cut their emissions while growing the economy. Between 2009 and 2011, emissions in RGGI states fell at a rate 2 times greater than non-RGGI states, even as the GDP in RGGI states grew 3% more than non-RGGI states. Over the period of 2005 to 2013, RGGI states experienced a reduction in over 40% in power sector CO2 emissions, while the regional economy grew by 8%. RGGI is a market-based mechanism similar to programs that have been done in the past with broad bipartisan support, successfully reducing pollution that cause acid rain and put holes in the ozone layer. RGGI would help Virginia by funding flooding solutions in Virginia, reducing harmful carbon emissions, and improving economic development in every corner of the Commonwealth. It helps invest in clean energy and energy efficiency, and it helps protect our military bases in Hampton Roads. A diverse coalition has backed Virginia joining RGGI, including the American Association of Pediatrics, the Norfolk City Council, the Union of Concerned Scientists, the Virginia Housing Coalition, and many more. RGGI is something that the state should be embracing, and we should not be trying to slow it down through an unnecessary roadblock here in the House of Delegates. I hope you'll vote against this bill that unnecessarily hamstrings the governor and our efforts to address climate issues in the Commonwealth. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Charlottesville, Delegate Toscano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the delegate from Franklin resume the floor for a question?
The delegate yield for a question.
I yield, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask the delegate, is he aware that the governor has proposed that any money raised from the auctions derived from RGGI be spent in a way that 77% of that money goes for coastal flooding and resiliency in the coastline?
Mr. Speaker, I'm aware the governor's proposed that, but the legislature has not been in a decision-making framework of RGGI, so I believe that we would, here in the General Assembly, appropriate the money as appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the bill.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I want to take you back a couple of decades to the 1980s. It was a time where there were a lot of cities in this country that were beset with smog, and the words of the day were sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides, or SOx and NOx. At the time, environmentalists were very, very aggressive. They knew that these particulates were being emitted from power plants, and they were trying to argue that all power plants of whatever size and whatever nature ought to have to pay for scrubbers to make sure these particulates were caught before they went into the air. That was a strategy that did not work. And as Einstein once said, if you always try what you always have tried, you'll always get what you always got. It wasn't working. So a number of creative people, including the Mr. Markets of the 1980s, came up with a different scenario that was based on economics and business principles. And they said the following: sure, businesses ought to be free to pollute, but if they pollute more than a certain amount, they ought to pay some money to those people who don't pollute as much. It was known as cap and trade. You put a cap on the total amount of emissions that were coming out, and you would trade allowances to and from businesses that were either emitting too much or businesses who had invested money to cut down their emissions. What happened? Dramatic change in the environment, improvement in health issues, smog reduced. A classic case of a market-based approach that actually worked. So what is RGGI? RGGI is an attempt to bring that principle to the emission of CO2. And what have we found? Well, we have found in RGGI states, it actually works. CO2 emissions in RGGI states have been reduced 50% since the program came online. That's pretty effective. Now, why do people think it's so important to deal with carbon dioxide emissions? It's called climate change and sea level rise. And there are a lot of people in this body who live near enough to the coast to know what's happening. Now, sure, you could say, well, Norfolk is sinking. And you know what? It is sinking. So what? Sea levels are also rising. And if those increases in sea levels get to the point that has been predicted by our own Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, which predict between 1.5 and 3 feet of sea level rise in the next 50 years, you're looking at a totally different operation, a totally different landmass. And I'm going to start investing in potential seafront property, oceanfront property that's 10 miles inland, because that's what's going to happen at great cost to the Virginia taxpayers. So, don't take my word, take the word of the Department of Defense, who just said, this is January's report, the Department of Defense said the effects of climate change on national security is really significant, and the potential impacts to DoD missions and installations is severe. Can you all say the words Oceana and BRAC? And can you think about what the implications are of the DoD deciding that they're not going to put installations in places that are at a risk for sea level rise? Don't take my word. Take the word of Dewberry, an engineering consultancy, who recently for Virginia Beach did a pretty massive study about the impacts of sea level rise, not just in Virginia Beach, but in Gloucester, Poquoson, lots of places where people you represent live. And what did they find? A projection of $50 to $271 million a year in losses unless we do something. So the governor tried to do something, but it's been rejected so far. The governor tried to put money directed towards
Would the gentleman
I will yield when I'm finished.
Thank you.
Delegate Clancy, yield.
The governor put money in to change the allocations and get money to Virginia Beach and places that could experience sea level rise. That's what you're going to vote against here, against getting that money because you're going to say, we can't join RGGI, we can't get the money. And instead what you're going to do is you're going to give it to Dominion Power. So if you like Dominion Power and you don't want the money going to Virginia Beach, you vote for this bill. But if you want the money to go to the places where it ought to go, don't hamstring the governor. Please vote against this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will yield.
Delegate Poindexter.
Mr. Speaker, I'll just speak to the bill. Thank the gentleman.
Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, members of the body, I just heard quite a bit of explanation about how great Reggie was and a lot of other technical information. But I didn't hear any information on why we should not have a vote on this, that the governor should be able to go along or under the jurisdiction and carry out some program. And just this last Thursday, I noticed that the State Corporation Commission says that Reggie's going to end up maybe costing each of our meter holders back home up to $12. And Reggie may not be in the success that it's all pretended to be, because generation and the jobs go with electricity generation have left those northeastern states. They've written off their current plants and investments and stuck the ratepayers with those and decommissioning practices, and local governments are not getting the tax revenue from it.
Mr. Speaker,
Delegate from Charlottesville, Douglas Scano.
will the delegate yield for a question?
I yield.
Question, delegate yields.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the delegate, are you familiar with the studies which actually show that electricity rates have declined in Reggie states by 6.4% versus increasing in non-Reggie states by 6.2%? Are you aware of that information?
Mr. Speaker, I would say to the gentleman, I'm looking at the rates in New Jersey, and they're 13.32, in New York 14.74, and Rhode Island 16.42, and Vermont 14.6. So if they've gone way down, they're still a whole lot more and a lot higher than Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, will the delegate yield for a question?
Delegate yield for another question.
I yield.
I'd ask the delegate, isn't it true that the electricity rates do rise and fall in different states every year, but on general, they have fallen in Reggie states since the time of the program, and they've increased in non-Reggie states since the time of the program?
Mr. Speaker, I would answer the gentleman that when we were asked to join PJM in a regional thing, our rates were a lot lower than they were in those same northeastern states, and after we joined, our rates tended upwards. So there's something about being in good company or bad company that can affect your electricity rates.